Good evening, everyone. Whether you are patriots, royalists, or independents, we warmly welcome you as we celebrate two remarkable anniversaries. The 250th anniversary of the American Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution, and also the 259th year of the Brick Presbyterian Church in the city of New York. I'm Gracie Stoddard, Brick Church elder and current chair of the Brick Church Book Club, a co-sponsor of tonight's event with the church's History and Archives Committee. If you love books and conversation, I invite you to join our book club, which meets once every 6 weeks, both in person and by Zoom. Details are always available on the Brick Church website. In anticipation of tonight's program, the book club recently discussed The Greatest Sentence Ever Written by Walter Isaacson, a slim but powerful book examining the careful collective crafting of the Declaration of Independence. We chose it as a fitting introduction to this evening's focus on United States history, its values, and faith in its people at a pivotal moment in history. Before we begin, I want to recognize one person whose scholarship inspired tonight's gathering. Brick Church member and lawyer E. Dean Turner, the author of the Brick Presbyterian Church in the City of New York, a fellowship of Kindred Minds published in 2017. This evening also marks the launch of the newly indexed digital version of Dean's 2-volume work, now available on the Brick Church website. Dean is unfortunately not able to be with us tonight, but we know he's watching remotely. So I ask you to join me in thanking him and honoring with applause. It is now my honor to introduce our speakers. From left to right, Dr. Amanda Bellows, Brick Church member, historian, and professor of the New School in New York City, and author, who will moderate this evening's discussion. Her third nonfiction book, Empire on Fire, the New York City disaster that ended the Gilded Age, will be published next year by St. Martin's Press. She is joined by Dr. Kenneth T. Jackson, Jacques Barzan, Professor Emeritus of History at Columbia University. And next to him, Margaret Stocker, Brick Church elder and chair of our church's History and Archives Committee. And next to her then is Dr. Charles Guth, Brick Church Seminarians Director, and our senior minister, Dr. Thomas Evans. Please help me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you, Gracie, for your remarks. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge the work of the Brick Church Book Club and the History and Archives Committee in preparing for tonight's event. It's an honor to be with you tonight to talk about the American Revolution, the role of the Brick Church in our nation's founding, why this history matters, and how we can learn from the past to inform our future as a church community. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Kenneth Jackson.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here tonight. I spent my life studying history and New York City, so it could hardly be a more appropriate topic for this evening. And the Brick Church is especially important, older than the United States. I mean, how many places can say that? And it was a competitive environment that this church has succeeded in for so many decades. I have a friend, John Butler, who was a historian at Yale, head of the history department there, and then dean of the graduate school. He wrote a book called God in Gotham. And I would say he knows about as much about religion in this history as anybody. And he said to me that what's remarkable is New York City has 4 times as many, it was his estimate, there's no exact number here, 4 times as many churches as London. And there were times when London was bigger. And of course, Britain has had established churches and stuff like this, whereas you and I could start a church tomorrow night, probably, if we really wanted to. So churches are born and die in the United States with alarming frequency. And the stability and history and importance of Brick Church can hardly be overstated. There, of course, are not many other churches in New York that can match the Brick Church. You know, First Presbyterian, I suppose, might be one. But the big fame, Trinity would be another, where I was on the vestry for many years. But it's not many. I mean, what do restaurants last 3 years on average in the United States? Churches a little longer, but 258 years is extraordinary. But we have experts here who'll talk about that, and I'm going to more talk on New York City and the American Revolution. I'm going to say now, I'll speak hyperbolically and in great generalizations, but it's clearly my view, and I'll elaborate on this, that New York was the story of the American Revolution. We, of course, all hear about Lexington and Concord, the Battle of Bunker Hill in Boston, and the famous midnight ride of Paul Revere. But George Washington and the British knew very early that New York was the story. Bunker Hill and Lexington and Concord were just skirmishes as far as the British concerned. But when they decided they were in for a real contest, they met the high command in London and decided, well, they looked at a map, and the map told them a lot. The most important colonies then were Virginia and Massachusetts. It's only after 1800 that New York becomes the Empire State and leaves them behind. But the Hudson River divides Massachusetts from Virginia, and you could just look at a map and see that. And more than that, there's a harbor here. It's not just a harbor. It's probably the best harbor in the world, and probably the best location for a world city on the planet, because it has a river that never freezes. Did he just say that? Well, I don't think anybody wants to walk to New Jersey. There is ice floating around, but basically it's a true statement. There have been a couple of times in history when there's been a lot of ice in the East River, the Hudson River, but it really didn't impede water transportation, as it would, let's say, in Montreal, which shares so many characteristics of New York and Island, not the capital, but St. Lawrence River freezes. I mean freezes, not sort of freezes. And Boston does not have nearly as good a harbor, and it doesn't have easy water access to the interior of the continent, and New York does. But it's kind of, when we think of early American history, we often think of Boston, and we don't think of its handicaps, and a lot of them are geographical. The mountains are between Boston and the west. Well, they're between New York and the west also, but there's a valley called the Mohawk Valley, and they built the Erie Canal through there. And if you go north to Albany, Troy, and hang a left, 320-something miles, you wind up in Buffalo and the Great Lakes. Philadelphia and Boston couldn't really compete with that. We'll talk about it in a minute. But so what I would say is that Boston is already in relative decline relative to New York by the time of the American Revolution. Just think of what we remember about Boston. The Boston Massacre in 1770, which just killed 6 people. The Boston Tea Party in 1773. The coercive acts when they closed Boston Harbor, the British did, because they thought there was something funny about Bostonians. There was something in the food or something else, and so they prohibited meetings of more than several people. But an urban historian would say one of the reasons for Boston's being peculiarly combative with the British was its economy was in decline by that time. I love New England, but it's got poor soil. You can't grow a lot. It's got rocks in the ground, lots of trees, backbaking work to clear the land to make a farm. And there's a lot better land in Illinois and Ohio and Indiana, not to mention Mississippi and other places. It took them a while to figure that out, but they did. So it's gorgeous now for your weekend house, but not so much to grow anything. The real story of the American Revolution, or the real competitor to New York, was Philadelphia. Not as old as Boston. By the way, Boston's not as old as New York either. We need to all remember that. We missed a huge opportunity this year by not celebrating the 400th anniversary of New York City. It's just a major failing of the Eric Adams administration. There should have been banners all over the city. There should have been balloons in the Thanksgiving Day parade. There should be all sorts of stuff. Because Philadelphia and Boston and a few other places can share 250 with us, but they can't share 400 because they didn't exist when New York started. But that's another story. But Philadelphia in the time of the American Revolution was better placed than Boston. It had Benjamin Franklin, who many people think of as the first American. It was the most populous city, had 40,000 people, pretty big in the American Revolution. But New York City won this contest, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, about what happened with Philadelphia. But let's talk about the summer of 1776, when New York becomes a central place in the American Revolution, because the British left Boston. They could have gone back anytime they wanted, but they kind of looked at a map and said, it's out in right field somewhere. It's not in a strategic position. And they decided to come to get this great harbor and the great river. And George Washington looked at the same maps, and see, all decided the same thing. George Washington moves his army, such as it was, early summer of 1776 to Lower Manhattan. The British begin to move soldiers to the city, not to the city, to the harbor. They were like the 800-pound gorilla. The Royal Navy could put people wherever it wanted to, and Britain was the leading military power of the 18th century. So what the British do is begin to, well, there are more than 400 ships in the harbor. There haven't been 400 ships in the harbor ever since. This is the biggest invasion force in history in North America. And I want to put a map on the board, the first one of New York's. Can we put that? Yes. Let me see if I've got a little pusher here. Because what I want to say, both George Washington and the British decided New York was the place when the war was starting in the summer of 1776. Now, what is George Washington's dilemma? And by the way, I'm going to say George Washington deserves the title of father of his country and did a good job, very good job, of leading the American fight for independence. He made mistakes. I don't know if this is a good suggestion, but here we are. I think you all recognize, well, we're up here somewhere, but this is Lower Manhattan. The army and the city were concentrated in the lower part of Manhattan. See, there's the East River. Now, the Royal Navy is all up in here in the bay, the big bay. This is Brooklyn. This is Staten Island right here. This is the Kills. But what George Washington had to think about was the Royal Navy not only had 400 transport ships, but 30 men of war. Now we think those are cute little wooden boats. Well, think again, because they could move by sail. They have 100 cannons on them and 2 or 3 decks. Think of Napoleon's Grand Army that invaded Russia in 1812. 500,000 men. One of the greatest military assemblages in history. But how did they get their cannons to Moscow? You got to drag those heavy weapons, non-existent roads. Think of the horses you got to feed and all that sort of stuff. A cannon is a hard thing to move. But the ships of the line, you just put them on the decks, and nature moves it along with wind. So you could move hundreds and hundreds of big guns, which would devastate New York City. George Washington knew this, so what he wanted to do was to put guns on Governor's Island. You don't know where Governor's Island is in the harbor. And the wonderful thing, by the way, is to go there on a glamping trip where you can spend the night, and it's wonderful. There's nobody there but you and a few other people. But anyway, there were American guns on Governor's Island, and he wanted to keep the Royal Navy from moving up the East River by catching the Royal Navy in enfilade fire. In other words, having somebody shoot at them from both directions. That's scary you never want that to happen. And so he thought he could hold Governor's Island. But the problem to hold Governor's Island is, it doesn't show it as closely here, but it's much closer to Brooklyn than it is to Manhattan. And the risk is, if you move your army to Brooklyn to protect Governor's Island, so you protect American artillery and protect the city and the harbor, what happens if it doesn't work? What happens if the American army is defeated by the British and it's in Brooklyn? Well, there's a problem there. There's water between Brooklyn and the city, and the Royal Navy, if they win it, can block that passage. So what happens is, I'm going to short circuit this a little bit, the British have more or less 30,000 soldiers, professional soldiers. That's important to remember. These are soldiers, and that's what they do. They're not farmers by day or clerks or something like this. They are soldiers. And when the first sound of gunfire, they don't run. They do what they're told. Now, we love to remember in our history textbooks in school that Americans hid behind rocks and trees and defeated the redcoats. Well, that's so much malarkey. We did a couple of times, but the truth of the matter is we couldn't fight the British Army. What I want you to do is think about the Vietnam War. Could some little country in the middle of nowhere defeat the most powerful country in the world? Of course not. But they did it, just like George Washington did, and used very similar tactics. And well, I'll come to more what those tactics are at the moment. But first, George Washington has to find out that they can't fight the British. What the British do is come all the way over here to southern Brooklyn, way away from the American army, and march north. And you can see this stretch here, which is the American defensive lines. And George Washington makes the tough decision. I'll chance it. I'll move the army to Brooklyn or Long Island. It's both the same thing. He does that. The British load their soldiers and unload them on the southern end of Brooklyn. And they move north toward us, toward here. And the Americans have a defensive line. I know you didn't come here to hear a lot about military strategy, but we didn't, you don't know who's going to win the football game until they play it sometimes. And so they played it. There were 3 passes in this defensive line, and there was a 4th pass on the far right side of the British thing that the Americans did not guard. So the British sent a flanking movement around the, let me see if where's my thing here? Here we go. Sent a flanking movement around the right side of the British army, the left side of the American, and fell upon the Americans from the rear. That's, whether it's Gettysburg or anywhere else, you do not want an enemy army attacking you from the side or the rear when you're facing them in the front. So it was simply a mistake that we made. By the way, George Washington didn't. I turned it over to Daniel Green and others. He stayed in Manhattan safely. I don't know. He didn't actually direct the battle on the ground. So the British come around from this side, defeat the American army. I don't mean this was the biggest battle of the American Revolution. Most people have never heard of it. Battle of Brooklyn, it's often called the Battle of Long Island. Why have we never heard of it? Because we got our butts kicked. That's why. Whatever, and so nobody knows about it. We decided to erase it from history pretty much. It was the biggest battle of the American Revolution. Mostly the Americans ran and could not stand up to the regular army, the British soldiers, or the Hessians, the Prussians. And by the way, the British have a saying, since Britain has been in so many wars over the years: you do not know war until you have fought the Germans. So the Germans were professional soldiers called Prussians, even then, and they were part of it. Anyway, they came around the side. Let's see the next slide, please. So here are the Americans trying to fight and defend the area. Change it. We don't obviously have photographs of this. Change it. So, you know, there's the American flag, such as it is. And some of them fought for a while with distinction, but they were overwhelmed by superior numbers, superior leadership, and superior training by the Redcoats and the Hessians. This is kind of a proud picture because it's looking like we're doing pretty well. Change it. And this is a famous thing. Some of you have been there. The old stone house in Brooklyn. Except for the heroism and sacrifice of a Maryland regiment, which defended the area around the old stone, which is still there in Brooklyn, and is a National Historic Site. They helped preserve some semblance of order with the American Army and sacrificed a lot to do that. Change it? Well, what happens is the British win a big victory. August 29th, 1776. Essentially sweep the Americans away, except for the stone house. It's easy for historians, since I had no skin in the game, to say at the end, big mistake by the British, but they decided to stop their army, not keep moving and drive the Americans into the East River. Just stopped. It had a hard day, work, let's stop it. So they stopped, more or less, Brooklyn Heights. What they should have done is put just 2 of their 30 warships into the East River, and the escape of the Continental Army would have been impossible. David McCullough, in his book 1776, that some of you had read, talk about that miraculous escape, how the Americans pushed against the Brooklyn Heights and the waterfront, rowed back and forth the little canoes all night long, had a few soldiers kind of making a lot of racket to make the British not know they were leaving. And under the cover of fog and good luck, the American army escaped. It shouldn't have happened. I mean, by logic. The war should have been over. The Americans surrendered. We gave it a shot. We didn't work. And now the whole American army is prisoner. Anyway, that's one of the miracles of history. It's interesting. So we lose that battle. It takes a little while for the British to move us up through Manhattan. There are other skirmishes. One big one is up around my old office in Columbia. And then White Plains is an extreme northern extent of the battles around New York City. And then Fort Washington. I don't know if you've been to we haven't been in Fort Washington, but many of you have been to that park in, I guess, near the George Washington Bridge, the Manhattan side. They've got it in a park, painted out where the outlines of the fort were. The Americans held out. The British had the war. Well, the British have the ocean. But let me go back to the previous one if we could. Well, maybe two or three back. Go back again, and another one. Okay. What the British do is begin to move their fleet now because Governor's Island is uncovered, so it can't catch the Americans in enfilade fire, and the army is kind of halfway destroyed anyway. The British sail up the North River, the Hudson River, more or less where the George Washington Bridge is now. That's not quite it, but there was a defensive fortification there. The British attacked it from all sides, and the Americans surrendered. There are details here and there, but essentially the American experience in the first year of the American Revolution in New York was militarily a failure. Heroism, yes, but success, no. So let me just go forward now a little bit. But anyway, the British put themselves between New Jersey and Manhattan to prevent George Washington from trying to escape. Change that again. Forward, 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 forward. Now, after George Washington essentially loses the battles around New York City, for more than 5 weeks, he stays in this house, which is in a way the oldest house in Manhattan, built in 1765 by a British Army colonel named Morris, Roger Morris, I think. And he leaves when the American Revolution starts. And this is a mansion. It's at about 163rd Street now and St. Nicholas Avenue. Hardly anybody goes there. If it were not there, it would be a national historic treasure, overrun with tourists, but it's not much overrun now. But this is called the Morris Jumel Mansion because it was built for Colonel Morris in 1765. And then after the American Revolution, a guy named Stephen Jumel moved there, and he was the richest man in North America. That's another story. We won't concern ourselves with it. But if you've not been there before, it's worth a visit. Actually, they're replacing the roof right this minute. And you can't see what they could see, and George Washington could see in 1776, because now it's near what's called Sugar Hill, which became a place where Thurgood Marshall and all sorts of famous black historians lived, and tall buildings. So the view toward Lower Manhattan is blocked now. And so is the view of the way of the Hudson River. You could see the Harlem River, or the East River. But that building, that's where George Washington slept alone. No sexual scandals or financial scandals, I think, are attached to his life. And he was there, and this building behind us, change the next slide. Well, you can't see it, but behind this building is the first octagon or 8-sided room in the United States. And you can go visit it. There was a famous meal there with Thomas Jefferson, all sorts of leading American figures, and George Washington, and Alexander Hamilton. But what I think is the important thing about it, this is an interpretation. It's not an interpretation he was there. We know George Washington was there. But that's where I think his genius was revealed. As he lay by himself in that second-story octagon bedroom, I think he must have been wondering what to do. He heard his troops run before the British regular army, and then lost a couple of other battles. And he must have thought, well, maybe I can put on a disguise and go to Ohio where nobody knows who I am. Because, that's treason. He fought against the flag, against the British crown. And the penalty for that is death, the execution. Or he could fight the British a couple more times and probably lose. But he hit upon something probably in that house, and it wasn't all at once, but I do think Ho Chi Minh learned from it in Vietnam. How do you fight the most powerful country in the world when you're a little, unorganized, undisciplined force? And what he decided to do, and this is I'm not the only person who says, is to run and hide. Never let your army be engaged in a full-scale battle with the redcoats, because they will drive you to extinction. You can do like he did, Washington crossing the Delaware to track Trenton and other places. When? December 25. The British thought that was kind of chicken shit to attack at night on Christmas. What are you thinking about? What kind of gentleman are you anyway? But he only had 2,400 troops, which is not a major force. But it was good. Restored some morale. but it wasn't what the British would call a major battle. Anyway, I think this is what he does. I'm going to wind this up. I'll try to be quicker. Anyway, so his American strategy, I think, is to protect his military force. He did escape across the East River. I should say a word about the prison ships. When he escaped across the Hudson River, the British had more American prisoners than George Washington had American soldiers. It does not look good for us. But, and the British had prisoners, and one of the little-known stories of the American Revolution are the prison ships. The British put their prisoners on old, broken-down transport ships in the harbor near now what's Brooklyn Navy Yard in Wallabout Bay. The British they threw food down to them every day. It was horrible conditions. There's a legend that the British Quartermaster General was having an affair with the wife of the British Commander-in-Chief, and the deal was he would let the Quartermaster General serve the Americans poor produce if he could have his way with his wife. I don't say that that's true, but it's a legend that goes true. But whatever it is, more people died in those prison ships in New York Harbor. This was the British, I don't think I said this, the headquarters of the British Army and Navy all 7 years of the American Revolution. This was the place. This they would defend. This is where they kept their prisoners. Some also in other buildings as well, but it was tragic. And there's a monument in Fort Greene Park called the Martyrs Monument because the bones of those, and many of them could have escaped that fate if they had joined the Royal Navy as ordinary seamen, and they mostly refused to do that. So when we think about who we should honor in the American Revolution, it's the prisoners is one. And the Morris Jumel Mansion should be well known. And anyway, the battle's then about New York. New York is really, in 1776, the center of the action for both armies. And we generally lose. Let me just say a word about the other battles. Saratoga, we won. The British made a mistake and got their army upstate, away from their base, where the Americans could surround it. And the important thing about Saratoga is it brought in France. It had been a civil war till France joined the United States in 1778, and then it becomes an international war. For the rest of the war, essentially, it's about the Hudson Valley. You know, all those towns up and down the Hudson Valley were where the George Washington and the British contended. And that's not an opinion, that's pretty much a fact. That's where George Washington was most of the time. Valley Forge was a little bit of an exception, but even then they didn't get south of. And then after 7 years, the British get trapped in Yorktown. What happens in Westchester County? The French general convinced George Washington to leave Westchester and attacking New York or bothering New York and go south to Virginia because the French Navy was going to go south and the French Army now was going to help. And between the French Army and Navy going south toward Yorktown, Virginia, they could trap the American Army, the British Army, Cornwallis. And that's because of France. And so Saratoga had a lot to do with that. Anyway, that's not there was no fighting going anywhere else as the Swamp Fox in South Carolina, stuff like this. But the major action was in and around New York City. So then there's Evacuation Day. Yorktown, the British surrender at Yorktown in 1781. It's not until 1783 that the Treaty of Paris is signed and the war officially ends. And it officially ends where? New York City. When the Redcoats, the British Army and the Royal Navy, pull up stakes, sail out of the harbor. That day was celebrated for more than a century until World War I, until more or less we were allied with the British, so we didn't want to celebrate the defeat of the British at the time. So let me just sum up some of my points because I'm running out of time. First of all, New York is the story of the American Revolution. The British knew it, and George Washington knew it. George Washington, I think, deserves his reputation as the father of his country. He did not run when he could have run. He fought. He learned that we could not really fight the British straight up. The city burned twice. I didn't mention this, in 1776 and 1778. And I should say, we have the best fire department on the planet. We had never had a fire after the fire department existed in 1865. I say, don't I watch the news? Yes, I do. But I'm talking about a fire that the fire department couldn't put out in a day, like they've had in Baltimore and Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, LA. That's it. The fire department has not found anything they couldn't deal with. And we can talk about that later. The story of Nathan Hale, who was a young officer in George Washington's army, 21 years old, was caught in the city after the British took the city. He was not wearing a uniform. He was a spy. Rules of war, immediate execution. And he was executed somewhere on the east side, probably not at 44th and Vanderbilt Avenue, but somewhere. We know he died. He was the one who reportedly said, I regret that I have but one life to give from my country. The French were critical in their help from 1778. I think perhaps the American Revolution set in motion New York City's supremacy over Philadelphia. At the time of the American Revolution, or at the end of it, New York was in ruins. Did I say two fires, 1776, 1778. The only other fire in New York history, big fire, 1835. That's called the Great Fire in New York. Anybody ever answer that on Trivial Pursuit? 1835. The fire department did not exist in 1835. Fire department exists from about 1865. No big fire since then. It's incredible. Then New York becomes, of course, the first capital of the United States. The Bill of Rights is passed here if I had more time, I would talk to you about why New York emerged, I think, from the American Revolution as the first city of the New World, essentially surpassing Philadelphia. And maybe in questions and answers we will have that.
Yes.
That's right.
We will
Okay.
have time.
So I won't continue to ramble here, but I'm happy to talk to that issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that engaging lecture, Professor Jackson. We learned a great deal from you. So let's move now from the broader historical landscape to the experience of the Brick Church and not only the congregation, but also the minister, John Rogers, during the American Revolution. I'd like to introduce Margaret Stalker, chair of Brick Church's History and Archives Committee. Let me give you the mic. So Margaret, I was hoping that you could start by telling us, drawing from Brick Church member Dean Turner's research, what do we know about just how the Brick Church survived during the Revolutionary War?
Yes, that was very important. Both Trinity Church and Brick Church were in ruins by 1783 when the British finally left. And it took about 2 years for Brick Church to be renovated so that we could have services. What's interesting is that in the interim, Trinity Church offered us their two chapels, St. Paul's and St. George's. So we worshiped there. And what's not clear, and I think I mentioned this in my talk, is whether the people from Trinity worshiped and prayed in the same church at the same time as we did. It was a wonderful gesture on the part of Trinity Church, and it tells a lot about Reverend John Rogers for him to have arranged that.
Full disclosure, I was on the vestry of Trinity Church, so.
So Margaret, how do you think that the outbreak of war in 1775 upended congregational life for Brick Church's members?
Well, there were loyalists and patriots in the congregation. And you know from attending Brick Church today that there are people who will never in this world read from the red hymnal. They like only the green hymnal or the blue hymnal. It was even more intense then because the Scots and the British both were sharing the Wall Street Church. And it wasn't until the Scotch left the Wall Street Church, started their own church, and Brick Church started in 1767 that the congregations were more united. Can you say that?
Could you talk a little bit about what the Brick Church's first minister, Reverend John Roberts, did as the British approached and it became clear that the city was going to be occupied?
He had no job left. He had no congregation. The building was being used initially as barracks and then as a hospital. And he left the city and he traveled, and we have this wonderful booklet with needlepoint covering of the almanac that he used and his diary of the years he was in various places in New Jersey and Connecticut, preaching to small congregations. He became an itinerant minister, which I think is a challenge for any itinerant minister today. You never know where you're going to be preaching and who's going to pay you next. And he was also chaplain to so he traveled with the army, and as I said to Dr. Jackson beforehand, I said, gosh, I wonder if he was a spy for George Washington. He, in his first sermon, which Reverend Evans preached this past Sunday, he talks in great detail about all the battles. Now, John Rogers didn't have a newspaper as he was traveling around, so maybe he was there. I can imagine him ministering to British soldiers who were close to death, as well as American soldiers.
Now, there were many members of the Brick Church congregation who played an important role as patriots during the Revolution. Some of them became soldiers or civic political leaders. I wondered if you could talk about some of the most notable members of the congregation.
Do you know who they are?
I'm not an expert on it.
No. I think Amanda is more than, well, for one thing, there was a Thomas Smith, who was a member of the Wall Street Church, and then an initial trustee of the Brick Church. And he was a merchant and a very successful one. He helped build Brick Church, raising funds. And he gave a wonderful silver basin, which we have in the back in this exhibit, which was perhaps used as a punch bowl then, but we use it sometimes for baptisms, and it has his coat of arms on it. The Livingston family, I know Dean is watching, and Dean could tell you every single person who was involved at this time, but I know he's done a lot of research on the Livingston family, who were members of Trinity, who, of course, held the strings of property, because Brick Church, being unchartered, wasn't able to own property, which is why we had to work with the Scottish Church of Scotland in order to be a bona fide church.
Thanks. Those are great examples, and I might want to give a shout out to one more historical figure.
Let me add a quick comment. The received wisdom about the American Revolution, and it's only a guesstimate, is that 1/3 of Americans wanted independence, 1/3 wanted to remain loyal to the British Crown, and 1/3 were living in remote places and really couldn't care less. We don't know that to be sure, But I would say that compared to other places, other cities, New York was known as a loyalist holdout. And when the war ended, a number of families left New York because they didn't feel comfortable here anymore. So more of a loyalist city than Philadelphia or Boston. And because the British Army and Navy were here, that kind of helped make the answer.
Yes, half my family left Connecticut to go to Nova Scotia, and George gave them a tract of land, and they're there still, enjoying the St. John River.
Well, I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to one really notable Brick Church member. His name was Alexander McDougall, and he was a man of Scottish descent who was a really early patriot. He helped found the local Sons of Liberty chapter in 1765, resisted the Stamp Act, and then during the war itself, he rose to the position of Major General, playing a key role in preserving Washington's army after the Battle of Long Island. So we had some real patriots in the congregation then.
So I'm not going to read what I had prepared, but I'm going to point to these ovals, these people behind us who were instrumental and close to the story of Brick Church. George Washington as General George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, who wrote a letter of recommendation to the Edinburgh University to recommend Reverend Rogers to get a Doctor of Philosophy so that he was a bona fide graduate. Could he have preached without that?
I don't think you needed a PhD, not then or now. In order to preach in the United States, you don't need anything. You can just start preaching. You have a very low barrier, which is part of our freedom of religion. Nobody authorizes anybody else to. You want to get IRS agreement that you've got a church. Beyond that, that's what it's about.
Well, you're speaking as a Trinitarian, of course. Where is, don't we have an image of, yes, Reverend Whitfield? And he was a rabble-rouser, Presbyterian, in Britain. And his sermons were published in Great Britain, and they were brought here. And then Benjamin Franklin, who was a publisher, repeated those sermons, and the Great Awakening happened here as well. There's another long story, which I won't have time to talk about, I think, but the portrait of Reverend Rogers was done by the same artist who painted the portrait of Alexander Hamilton. And the story is that in the tavern on Wall Street, the artist, unknown today, Wexler, I won't remember his name, said, I'm going to paint 100 portraits of Reverend Rogers, and you can pay me in advance. I think it was $5 or $9, something. So we don't know how many were actually painted, but we have 3 in our collection, and that's one of them. Now, the next year, 1806, he offered to paint portraits of Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, I thought, was much more popular after he died in a duel than Reverend Rogers, but it was the Rogers portrait that came first.
Well, Margaret, thank you so much for speaking about the Brick Church experience, and I hope we can continue the discussion during the Q&A. But next, I'd like to introduce Charles Guth, who is Brick Church's Seminarians Director and a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Theological Inquiry in Princeton. Dr. Guth, I was hoping you could tell us, how do moments of political upheaval challenge and clarify the role of faith for the church?
Thanks for this important question, Amanda. So one way I think political crisis can clarify the role of faith is by prompting the church to reflect more deeply on the meaning of its ethical and religious commitments. Let me illustrate this with a bit of history. So when I read Dean Turner's work on the role of Brick in the Revolutionary War, I was struck by the fact that the leaders of Brick were already committed to Republican forms of government prior to the war. And the reason for this, I suspect, is that the Presbyterian tradition had already developed deep affinities with democratic thought in the 17th century. One affinity with democratic thought was the Presbyterian tradition's deep opposition to tyranny. If you read John Calvin, you might be surprised, but you'll see that Calvin is very worried about tyrants. He worries that Roman Catholic theology in the medieval period portrayed God as a tyrant. He worries the Pope and the bishops are tyrants. He worries that many civil leaders in his time are tyrants. A tyrant in Calvin's day is a technical term. It means, or it refers to someone who has authority over a community, but who uses their office for private gain rather than the good of the community. Now, while Calvin vociferously opposed tyranny, he also insisted that people subject to tyranny couldn't resist a tyrant. But the Presbyterian tradition changed their view on that almost immediately after Calvin's death. And the reason was that they were prompted to reflect more deeply on this because of the French king's persecution of Protestants. This circumstance brought about a moment in which Presbyterian theologians thought that their commitment to opposing tyranny was practically insignificant unless they allowed for the possibility of resistance to tyranny. Around the same time, Presbyterian theologians also started to use their tradition of thinking about covenant to talk about politics. They began to think that a political community is constituted by a covenant between the people and the rulers of that community. And this was a key moment in the historical development of what we now call social contract theory, which is very roughly the view that the legitimacy of a political body depends on the consent of the people who are ruled by that. So, in sum, the Presbyterian tradition gradually developed the view that tyranny could be opposed with force and that political authority depends on the consent of the governed. And this was brought about by reflection on their own commitments about justice, but that was precipitated by deep political crisis.
Fascinating. Well, I've got one last question for you, and that is, do you think that there are theological lessons from this period that still speak to the church today?
Yeah, thank you. I think one important lesson from the history I was just telling is this Presbyterian tradition provides an important alternative to the Christian nationalism that has become prominent in some parts of America today. Christian nationalism isn't just the view that Christian values should shape politics or the view that America is in some way a Christian nation. What I think is fundamental about Christian nationalism is the willingness to impose one's own vision of Christianity on others, both against their will and by using the coercive power of the state. I think it's pretty clear that this Presbyterian tradition of democratic thought that I've been alluding to is in deep tension with Christian nationalism. The tradition of opposing tyranny should make us suspicious of any group that wants to impose its will or pursue its own benefit at the expense of others. But also the tradition of covenantal thought made the Presbyterian tradition very sympathetic to the idea that consent and the will of the people is essential to political legitimacy. So these ideas lend support to a pluralistic and deeply democratic conception of public life. But it's really important to notice, I think, that support for a pluralistic vision comes from within this faith tradition. It's not something imposed from without. It's the tradition reflecting on its own commitments to justice and the common good and accountability and what they mean for public life.
Great. Thank you so much for helping us think about these big questions. And now I'd like to introduce our last speaker, the Reverend Dr. Thomas Evans. Reverend Evans, how do you think that Brick Church's history during the Revolutionary era informs its mission and its witness today?
Thank you for that question. And it is eminently more relevant than I might have thought had I not read Dr. John Rogers' sermon. And I have some quotes here in front of me that will help articulate what I'm trying to convey. I am actually in awe, profound awe, at the thoughts and principles contained in that sermon and how relevant they are right in this moment we are living. Really critical for how it is that Brick should seek to be faithful to God's call. But he begins, part of his sermon, he talks about giving thanks to God. So an instance of divine goodness is his providing this state so good a constitution for securing our rights and privileges. It has imperfections like all human institutions, but upon whole it is equaled by few and surpassed by none. And so I think that recognizing as a congregation gifted to practice its religion in a land in which the Constitution itself helps to perpetuate our freedom to worship as we see fit, is something we need to be mindful, to be thankful for. There are many countries around this planet in which people are not able to worship free, and so we are grateful for that freedom to worship as we see fit. And then Rogers continues to talk about this rights of conscience, that everyone has a right to exercise their conscience as they believe God is leading them, no matter what their religion is. And so this is foundational to what it means to be Presbyterian, and we also know it's foundational to our country. This is what Rogers said: "No man is excluded from the rights of citizenship on account of his religious profession, nor ought he to be." So that we will seek to fight and support people's ability to exercise their religion as they see fit, whatever their doctrines happen to be. And then also we find ourselves right in the middle of a time where we have a great struggle as a country as to what is the country's point of view on immigrants in our midst, both legal and ones who are not properly documented. What is our point of view as a country? Our congregation is one that is a widely diverse congregation politically, but I think there is a sense of united call to follow the way of Christ in compassion. And what it means that this country was founded in such a way. And this is what Rogers said before 1789. "What great things God, the God of providence, has done. By the revolution we celebrate today, he has provided an asylum for the oppressed in all the nations of the earth, whatever the nature of their oppression." Now, I can't define exactly what that means for any one individual or the laws of this country, but what I do know is what it means for the people of Brick Church need to find a way to extend a compassion and support and the love of Christ to anyone who is within our midst and in our borders. And I hope and pray that Brick can find a way to do this with a sense of unity after the call of Christ. And then he also called us, John Rogers did, to what we now refer to as mutual forbearance. It's this principle of living with difference, with people of different opinions than our own. He wrote, "God's beneficence is designed to form us to a similar temper toward our fellow creatures. Even if many are unworthy, our own unworthiness has not barred from the mercy of heaven. We must especially be aware of resentment and revenge. True greatness rules the spirit." So this is a sense that when we disagree with someone else, even vehemently, that we must be aware of attitudes of resentment, of revenge. Greatness should rule our spirit because God has dealt with us with forbearance. And then he goes on to say, but it's not just about forbearing one another. It's not just about tolerating each other and putting up with one another. He says, the benevolence should manifest itself especially amid religious distinctions. It is not to be expected that we are all united in opinion, but may we be united in affection. So my hope and prayer is that BRIC will share that sense of being united in affection for others. In the midst of disagreements, sometimes deep disagreements, we still want to share and experience that love for our brothers and sisters, for our siblings of whatever faith. And then he also calls to compassion for those who are suffering. And he offers a rather pointed word to the congregation at the time. Can luxury and dissipation spare nothing for those in need? The approaching winter enforces this duty with an urgency that language cannot express. We know we find ourselves right now in a winter that is harsh. And so my prayer is that BRIC will never forget about those who find themselves out in the cold, both literally and figuratively. And then he has this somewhat of a closing remark about the country, about the congregation, about the state of New York. God has put within our reach all the blessings of civil and religious liberty. Perhaps no nation has ever had so fair an opportunity to become the happiest people on earth. Yet misery, as well as happiness, lies before us, unless the present state of things is wisely improved. I still believe that we here in this country, in this church, in this state, have the opportunity to be the happiest place on earth. But that's going to take a willingness to address some of the difficult situations that we face. It is my hope that when we think about the Declaration of Independence, that we can help live into the reality that God created all equal. So what can we do to help all truly mean all for everyone in our borders? When we think about the Founding Fathers and what they did, they created something that never before had happened in the world. We are deeply and immeasurably grateful for that. But we also know that they had blind spots, that all didn't truly mean all in their time. And so it makes me wonder, people of even such great stature in history, that there's clear areas that they failed in. So it makes me wonder, where is BRIC Church? Where are we not truly being aware of how all means all? And so I have a prayer for BRIC and for my own personal life, that God would open my eyes to my blind spots, that we can live into the call to Christ, that we will love God with all of our hearts, and that we will love our neighbor as ourselves.
So well said, Tom, and thank you for helping us apply these lessons from the Revolutionary era to the present today. Well, I think we have time for about 2 or 3 questions. So if you have any questions, please raise your hands and I will direct them. Yes.
Thank you. I was wondering, you spoke a lot about the Patriots. Oh, sorry. Hi. So you spoke a lot about the Patriots at BRIC Church. Were there also Loyalists? And what were some examples of what happened there?
Yes, there was land grab after the Dutch left in 1664 and the British came. And then when the British left and the Patriots came home and some Loyalists came home, they found that their property was not necessarily still theirs. And I think that's the greatness of Reverend Rogers, to put the Patriots and the Loyalists together and to preach them to them together in one room. It could not have been easy, but it's not easy today. That's, I think, the subtext of Dean's book, Kindred Minds. that with all these examples of how it had been done in the past, that we can learn how to be kindred minds today.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that is part of what was behind George Washington's letter, thanking John Rogers for helping to bring unity back to the country and through welcoming the Loyalists back to the congregation.
Hi, I'm just curious a bit as a New Yorker who grew up Presbyterian about the collegiate ministry of John Rogers with the First Presbyterian Church, which after all was first, but also with how the idea of the polity of the Presbyterian Church really did spawn a revolutionary moment and these patriots, whereas the Episcopalians, were not patriots in the same way, even though George Washington might have prayed at St. Paul's. The patriots came from the Presbyterian Church, and I'm just curious what you may or may not know about that. Sorry.
Trinity has had a lot of ups and downs over the years, and because it's a large parish, because it's extremely well-endowed parish, because it's, I think what has happened in the long run, though, it's a very integrated parish now, racially. Black members from Brooklyn who were from Jamaica and places like that, and Episcopalians there. Some established white families who are proud to be New Yorkers for many, many decades, and an increasing number of local residents, because Trinity, and it moved away from, well, here's the difference between Brick and Trinity. Brick moved its physical location several times till it wound up on 92nd and Park. Trinity stayed in the same place. And so its congregation moved away beginning, really, I'll say this in general terms, early 19th century, as Lower Manhattan became the first real central business district on earth. And what could happen in 1810 was that any business could outbid any residential use. So the population was pushed uptown, toward Grace, toward St. James, toward other places. Trinity happened to have the money that it could stay where it was.
But actually, I'm sorry, I'm really talking more about the polity of the Presbyterian Church with the synod and the elders, the deacons, the trustees, versus Episcopalianism, which is more hierarchical in a different sort of way. So insofar as the Presbyterians have this grounded in their polity, you have a kind of democratic way of thinking of politics.
Yeah, okay, good. So there are deep similarities between American federalism and the way Presbyterian polity works. There's also just the fact that Presbyterian polity is a kind of representative. I mean, the polity structure of a Presbyterian church is the equivalent to republicanism in politics. So some people, this is not an area of historical knowledge of mine or expertise of mine, but my understanding is that it's a pretty common view that Madison in particular was influenced by Presbyterian polity when he was writing the Federalist Papers in particular. So I think it is clear that ecclesiology and polity and theology had an influence on how both the founding fathers themselves were thinking about politics and political government, but also the various thinkers that they were drawing on. You know, even someone like John Locke is deeply influenced by religious thought. So I think you're spot on to point some
Well,
similarities.
this is how
there.
my parents told me to be a Presbyterian and not an Episcopalian.
And we are very grateful for Episcopalians here at Brick these days. And in fact, we're probably the most Episcopalian Presbyterian church
I
that
know.
exists in this country. And so that's another example of the history that John Rogers started, is to welcome back the Loyalists. And now it's a congregation that is very close, has close kinship with many of our Episcopal sister churches in the neighborhood.
In the early days of the revolution, I assume that there was a split between those who wanted to remain loyal to England and those who favored the Americans, and those in the middle, as somebody mentioned them. But between the two, and having lived through several issues here in the church, and I know how they divided people. I'm wondering if you could tell us how Brick Church handled that conflict at the beginning, early days of the Revolution.
I can almost answer that we're very fortunate to have a lot of history in our archives, and it includes Reverend Rogers' assistant, Reverend Miller, writing a memoir of Rogers. So they knew each other, they were contemporaries, and probably factually true, right? I mean, it's not like they were writing without without knowing their subject. And then after Miller, we had Reverend Gardner Spring, who stayed here 60 years, was influential in the synod regarding, in the New York Presbytery, regarding the church's opinion on slavery. And that's a huge subject to start into. But my point is that Reverend Spring's great-grandson then wrote the history of the church from 1809 to 1909. And then Dean Turner wrote the church for the next epoch. So we're very fortunate to have this verisimilitude.
Well, I'd like to thank all of our speakers tonight and to thank all of you for your engagement. And I would like to offer a chance for Tom to give closing remarks.
I'm very grateful for all of you all up here this evening and the great expertise that you've brought. So let's give them a great round of applause. And if any of you would like to explore some of this some more, during the season of Lent on Sunday evenings here at Brick, we are going to be looking at the founding values and holding them juxtaposed with certain biblical notions and discussing how it is that we might more effectively live into these today, some of these founding values. And it's going to be an open conversation. And then the sermon series throughout Lent is going to be doing the same thing. Our founding values, their biblical roots, and how we can help make all truly mean all. So we hope that you'll avail yourselves, if you're able, to come and be a part of our worship during the season of Lent. And we're grateful for your presence this evening. And I'd like to close this with a word of prayer, if I could. Let us bow our heads. Wondrous God, we are grateful for all that you have done throughout history. And we are mindful that each moment that people live in is a moment to make history. And we pray years from now, when people write down the story of our day, that they will do so with a sense of the people here in this room, in this congregation, in this state, in this country, in this world, that they were all seeking the betterment of this world, that the kingdom here on earth could look more like your kingdom in heaven. Help us to share the love that we have been given, the measure of forgiveness, of forbearance, and love. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.